the genealogy of God's faithfulness, but we could have also entitled it the genealogy of Israel's king. I've chosen the genealogy of God's faithfulness. Listen as I read God's word, Matthew chapter 1. The book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Abraham was the father of Isaac, and Isaac the father of Jacob, and Jacob the father of Judah and his brothers. And Judah the father of Perez and Zerah by Tamar, and Perez the father of Hezron, and Hezron the father of Ram, and Ram the father of Amminadab, and Amminadab the father of Nahshon, and Nahshon the father of Salmon, Salmon the father of Boaz by Rahab, and Boaz the father of Obed by Ruth, and Obed the father of Jesse, and Jesse the father of David the king. And David was the father of Solomon by the wife of Uriah, and Solomon the father of Rehoboam, and Rehoboam the father of Abijah, and Abijah the father of Asaph, and Asaph the father of Jehoshaphat, and Jehoshaphat the father of Joram, and Joram the father of Uzziah, and Uzziah the father of Jotham, and Jotham the father of Ahaz, and Ahaz the father of Hezekiah, and Hezekiah the father of Manasseh, and Manasseh the father of Amos, and Amos the father of Josiah, and Josiah the father of Jeconiah and his brothers, at the time of the deportation to Babylon. And after the deportation to Babylon, Jeconiah was the father of Shealtiel, Shealtiel the father of Zerubbabel, and Zerubbabel the father of Abiud, and Abiud the father of Eliakim, and Eliakim the father of Azor, and Azor the father of Zadok, and Zadok the father of Achim, and Achim the father of Elihud, and Elihud the father of Eleazar, and Eleazar the father of Mathan, and Mathan the father of Jacob, and Jacob the father of Joseph, the husband of Mary, of whom Jesus was born, who is called Christ. So all the generations from Abraham to David were 14 generations, and from David to the deportation to Babylon, 14 generations, and from the deportation to Babylon to the Christ, 14 generations. I have your Bibles handy. You put it by the pew beside you, if you will. We're going to look at that together. I've chosen a Lord's Day, too, to echo what we're looking at this morning. Turn to page 215 in the Forms booklet. Question 35, page 215. We just confessed this in the creed that we recited together. What does it mean that he was conceived by the Holy Spirit, born of the Virgin Mary? That the eternal Son of God, who is and remains true and eternal God, took to himself through the working of the Holy Spirit from the flesh and blood of the Virgin Mary a true human nature, so that he might also become David's true descendant, like his brothers in all things except for sin. And it's that phrase here that we're going to look at in Matthew's gospel this morning, so that he might also become David's true descendant. David's true descendant. So if you like, you might also turn in your bulletins and take notes. The bulletin is more or less designed for the little kids, which will be coming up here in a second. So if you're taking notes, you might actually want to find more room because I got a lot of fun stuff to share with you this morning. Ruth, the book of Ruth, ends with a genealogy. I kind of glossed over it at the end, not referring to it specifically, but as I mentioned, David was this great grandson of Ruth and of Boaz. So the book of Ruth ends with that genealogy, which is reproduced in part in Matthew's genealogy. So Ruth ends with a genealogy, Matthew begins with a genealogy. Now we read this in the 21st century, and we say to ourselves, what a boring way to begin a book. Who begins a book with a genealogy? That's just like a real killer. It's like y'all trying to, you're a new convert, you start at the Bible like you read any book from cover to cover. So Genesis, okay, that worked all right. Exodus, that worked okay. Leviticus, all right, this is Numbers, you get genealogies. What's up with genealogies? What's up with all these names? Well, let's dig into it. Because we're going to find the gospel is even in a genealogy. What is a genealogy? Here's a definition. You'll see it in the notes as well. Genealogy is the study of families, family history, and the tracing of their lineages. Lineages is the father begat the son begat so-and-so, he had that, he fathered so-and-so. It's a family tree. That's your lineage. You can go backwards to ancestors, or you can start here and you can work forward either way, but you're looking at the line, the lineage of a family. Well, why are genealogies, these family studies and genealogies and fathers and sons and so on, family lines, why are they so important? There's three reasons. The first reason is rather obvious. Because they didn't have last names. So that's how you knew what Jacob you were talking about. I'm talking about Jacob, the son of Joseph. Oh, I thought you were talking about the Jacob, the son of Benjamin. That kind of a thing, right? So it's a way of referring of a person's identity. So if you wanted to write it down, because last names were not invented, this was how you knew where a person came from. It's Joseph, son of Jacob. It's Jacob, son of Isaac. Oh, that Jacob. Here's another reason why genealogies are important. This was a way of telling history. Like so much of the Bible occurred before it actually was written down. Oral tradition is how so much of the Bible was relayed from generation. The book of Ruth was not written till about 200 years after it occurred. So recounting genealogies was a way of telling the story of history, of relating the events, because you would intersperse this genealogy like, oh yeah, and in this time the earth was divided, and during this son, Canaan, was conquered, etc. So this was a way of telling history and marking God's faithfulness, goodness, and grace. Because you're reading this long list line, you're saying, look how God has been faithful. This fathered he fathered so-and-so, he fathered so-and-so, and you're marking God's faithfulness, goodness, and grace. That's the second point. A way of telling history, marking God's faithfulness. Third reason, and this is what's before us this morning primarily, but this was one of the critical ways by which the Messiah would be identified. Ever since Genesis 3, verse 15, God had said that the Messiah would come, that there would be a seed of the woman. And so they would relate these genealogies because as more history of redemption unfolds, as more clarity comes to this promise, God will say, oh, he doesn't say oh, God says the child will come from Abraham. Oh, okay. So a genealogy of the Messiah needs to relate back to Abraham. And then God says, and the child, Messiah, will come from David. Oh, we need a genealogy that's going to connect from Abraham, not through Ishmael, not through his other 6 sons from Keturah, but we have to have a genealogy that relates from Abraham to David. Okay. So the genealogy was the critical way in which Israel would identify that's the Messiah, because he has the genealogy to back it up. Okay, there you go, first 3 points. Because last names weren't invented, a way of telling history, marking God's faithfulness, goodness, and grace, and the critical way by which the Messiah would be identified. A couple introductory comments here. Matthew, looking at Matthew's gospel, Matthew is writing to Jews. And so he naturally, obviously not to us, begins the book with a genealogy. You know how fairy tales begin? Once upon a time. Oh, I'm telling a fairy tale. Well, if you're writing to Jews, you begin with a genealogy. It's just tickling them right there. Yeah, that's right. Let's start with genealogies. Matthew's writing to the Jews, so he naturally begins his gospel with a genealogy in order to prove that Jesus, born to Joseph and Mary, is the true Messiah who had been long ago prophesied. So that's what's going on. Matthew begins the gospel with a genealogy because he's writing to Jews, and he's going to tell them, the burden of proof is on Matthew to prove that Jesus is the legal heir to the throne, descending from David, who descended from Abraham. So that's Matthew's audience. All right, point number 3 in my notes. It's not 3 in the bulletin. But we're going to look at verse 1 for some time. We're going to camp on verse 1. This introduction. The book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. The first two words in the Greek New Testament and the first two words in Matthew's Gospel are these words: Biblos, Geneseos. Biblos, book, Geneseos, or Genesis. The book of Genesis. What effect do you think that had upon a Jew? They have another book of Genesis, beginning. And Matthew says, book of Genesis, part 2. Matthew does, in his own unique way, what John did. How does John begin his gospel? In the beginning. And every Jew, bells are going off, ding, 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 ding. That's how Genesis begins. In the beginning, God created. And John says, in the beginning was the Word. So John, the Apostle John, writes his gospel, Genesis, part 2. And Matthew does it in his own way with the first two words, Biblos, Geneseos, the book of Genesis, part 2. Exciting stuff, right? This is going to really tickle the fancy of any Jew. Matthew, when he writes the book of so in English, it's translated with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 words. The book of the genealogy is 2 words in the Greek. But Matthew intentionally, starting at Biblos Geneseos, the book of genealogy in English, or in, as it would be in Latin, the book of Genesis, or in Greek, Matthew is saying this. He's preparing his reader for a new creation. Genesis is a book of creation. Genesis is the word that means beginnings. In the beginning, in the Genesis. And so Matthew writes using this vocabulary to say, I have a story about a new creation in the beginning. In Matthew's gospel, prophecies will be fulfilled. Promises will be realized, and faith will become sight. Both Matthew and John begin their gospels in the same fashion. Genesis, part 2. Furthermore, as we look at this first verse, it's full of glory. The book of the genealogy, which, as I have said, is just 2 words in the Greek, Biblos Geneseos, is the Greek equivalent of the Hebrew phrase that Moses uses, not in Genesis 1, verse 1, in the beginning, but the phrase that Matthew uses, the book of the genealogy, is the identical phrase that Moses uses in the book of Genesis. And he uses it 10 times in the book of Genesis. I want you to see a few of these times. Go to Genesis chapter 2, verse 4. So, this is called in Hebrew the Toledot. The Toledots of Genesis. 10 chapters. So Moses, I'm getting his name, Moses delineated Genesis into 10 groups, 10 chapters. This is the first one, Genesis 2, verse 4. These are the generations of. That's the exact phrase that Matthew uses. This is the book, or the book of the genealogy of. Same phrase. Go to chapter 5, verse 1. The book of the generations of Adam. Chapter 6, verse 9. These are the generations of Noah. Chapter 10, verse 1. These are the generations of the sons of Noah. Chapter 11, verse 10. These are the generations of Shem. Chapter 11, verse 27. These are the generations of Terah. And so on and so forth. There's 10 of those in the book of Genesis. Moses uses this linguistic phrase, these are the generations of, as a heading. And so we have the generations of the heavens and the earth. And when he does that, we have, here's the start, and here's the things that followed out of it. Here's the generations of Adam and the children that he had. And the generations of of Noah and the story that came from Noah, and then the story of Abraham, the generations of Abraham, and the descendants that came. So wherever you see that phrase, the generations of, you have an introduction of a patriarch or a father, and the story that continues from it. So this way in which Moses structures Genesis is to give to us, to give to us this flow of redemptive history. To say, here's a start line and a finish line, and a start line and a finish line. And a story is being told, chapter by chapter by chapter. Matthew intentionally chooses this Mosaic formula to tell his readers that a new and final chapter, the 11th Toledot, is beginning. The genealogy of Adam and of Noah and of Abram and of Terah before Abram, is now succeeded by, this is the generations of Jesus. To tell his readers that a new and final chapter in the history of redemption has begun. Each of these structures that Moses used in his outline always would communicate the sense of progression toward a goal. That's the use of that phrase, the generations of. There's a progression to an end determined by God. And so Matthew takes that Mosaic formula and says, here is the culmination of that storyline progressing toward a definitive end, a goal determined by God. He announces that he is going to recount the genealogy of the Messiah, which, as Moses used the term, will communicate progression toward a goal. So when a Jew read this book, the book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the Jewish man is thinking, here's a starting point, progressing toward consummation, conclusion. This genealogy of Jesus is going to terminate in some glorious end. The goal, as we know, because we've read the book cover to cover, is of course the culmination of the history of redemption and the consummation of all things. So we've looked at the first 5 words, the book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ. So, the name Jesus was not all that spectacular. It's simply the name Joshua. It was a pretty common name among the Jews, even in Jesus' own day. In the 1st century A.D., after Jesus had even ascended into heaven, the 4 of the 12 high priests in the temple were called Jesus. 4 of the 12. In the New Testament, in the book of Colossians, we encounter one man named Jesus who they call Justus. Here's my theory, is that I said 4 of the Jews of the first in the temple, they're not Christians. But when there were men named Jesus who were converted, they would go by different names. Jesus, who was called Justus. I don't think anybody wanted to take the name Jesus because that became a unique and an exclusive name referring to Jesus Christ. But anyways, back to our text. The book of the genealogy of Jesus. Oh, what Jesus are we talking about? There were 4 of them in the 1st century. We're talking about Jesus Christ. And that's where the bells went off, the whistles are blowing, the alarms are blaring, because Christ is not his surname, like your last name. Christ is a title that is related to the office that this Jesus fulfilled. Matthew is saying, I'm going to tell you the generations of Jesus, who is the Christ, Messiah. It's the same word, right? This is the book of Jesus Messiah. So when you pick up the Gospel of Matthew, when a Jew picks up the Gospel, he's saying, this is the story of Jesus Messiah. Messiah. That word is dynamite. That's the son Yahweh promised Eve. It's the child God promised Abraham and David, and down through history. The Messiah, Christ, the Anointed One. The familiarity we have with the title Christ makes us ignorant of the stunning display of the glory it conveyed. But for Matthew and for his audience, this word was just resplendent with all of heaven's brilliance. And so you see, for example, in verse 16, he says, of whom Jesus was born, who is called Christ. He concludes verse 17 of the deportation to Babylon to the Christ. And then if we go to verse 18, now the birth of Jesus Christ. So Matthew just front loads the text. He's saying, I am talking about Jesus, Messiah. And this is his story. Powerful stuff. All right, looking at the clock and I'm alarmed. This is Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. I'm going to skip a few things for the sake of time, but Matthew in his genealogy, what he does is he relates this Jesus, who I am telling you is the Messiah, is the one whose genealogical history traces back through David and all the way to Abraham. That's very critical. We don't have the time to look at the verses, but in Genesis 12, 15, 17, and 22, God says to Abraham, there's an offspring, there's an offspring, there's an offspring. To Galatians 3, you can turn there if you're quick. Galatians 3:16. I'll try to find it myself. Look at this. Now, the promises were made to Abraham and to his offspring. It does not say, and to offsprings, plural, referring to many, but referring to one, and to your offspring, who is Christ. It doesn't say Jesus. So Paul says, Abraham had these promises of an offspring, one man. That man is Christ. And Matthew says, and I'm telling you that man's story. The man who descended from Abraham. And also he descended from David. Go to the book of Romans here. So we're going to skip 2 Samuel 7, but you could write that in the margin. 2 Samuel 7 is where God promises to David that his son will sit on his throne. But if you go to the book of Romans, Paul says at verse 3, verse 1, Paul, a servant of Christ, Jesus, verse 3, concerning his son who was descended from David according to the flesh. So Paul is saying in Galatians and in Romans that the Messiah comes from David and Abraham. All right. This is big stuff. We are looking at the genealogy of Jesus, who is the Christ. Matthew, incidentally, does not go back to Adam, but only to Abraham. He starts at Abraham, and verse 2, Abram was the father of Isaac. He starts at Abraham, and he works his way forward all the way to Jesus. And he focuses here, more than any other gospel writer, I'm just thinking of a few things, that Jesus is the son of David. That's going to be key in this text. That Jesus is the heir to the throne. More than any other gospel writer, Matthew uses the phrase son of David more than Mark, Luke, or John. So as we finish off verse 1, anticipation leaps out of the text like racehorses when the gates fly open. That's how this text just erupts right into your face like a volcano. The story of Jesus Christ. Question in the bulletin, if Jesus was not an actual descendant of Abraham and David, could we be saved? No, we couldn't. He had to be a descendant of Abraham, to whom the promises were given, of whose offspring it was spoken, and to David, whose son was promised to sit on his throne. Okay, point number 4 in my notes, and you won't find this in the bulletin page. But there are notable differences between Matthew's genealogy and Luke's. And just to highlight a few of those, because they will help us see what Matthew's doing. Matthew starts with Abraham in verse 2. Abraham was the father of Isaac. And Matthew works from Abraham all the way to Joseph and Jesus. Luke starts with Jesus and works his way all the way back to Adam. Adam, not Abraham. Big difference, right? In these two genealogies, you would expect some overlap, but there's very few names that are identical in these genealogies, which have led some people to think or believe that Matthew recounts the genealogy of Joseph and Luke records the genealogy of Mary. That does not hold any water. The Jews held genealogies in great esteem, and Luke specifically says that his genealogy is the genealogy of Joseph, the son of Heli, or Heli. So both genealogies relate the genealogy of Jesus. How do we then unravel this web? Here's the best guess that we have, is that Matthew is relating not the biological descent of father to son, but the descent of the kingly throne. Sometimes the throne would pass from a father, to a second son, or from a father to a brother and to his son, and it would go like that. It wasn't always literally father to son, father to son. Luke will record the actual biological descent of father to son, father to son. What we are looking at in Matthew's gospel is the descent of the kings. And that becomes apparent not only by the great overlap in this text between the kings listed here and the kings listed in Chronicles and in Kings, but also evident in verse 6, where Matthew accents, I'm telling you that Jesse is the father of David, the king. And then to end, and then in verse 1 to say, I'm talking about Jesus, the son of David. So these are big names. Matthew is saying, I'm talking about a kingly descent. Here's another point of comparison. Luke's lineage, if you look at, it's Luke chapter 3. Luke's lineage is not traced through Solomon, David's royal successor, as we see here in our text, that it goes from David to Solomon. Luke traces Jesus' genealogy from David to his other son, Nathan. Are you following me? Matthew says Jesus comes through Solomon, David's son. Luke says Jesus comes through Nathan, David's other son. Nathan was his third son, or fourth son. Solomon was his fifth son. Incidentally, Bathsheba had 5 boys. Solomon was not the firstborn, the second, the third, or the fourth. Solomon was the last boy, the 5th son. Nathan was her 4th son. So Nathan is the biological father of Joseph, going all the way down, but Solomon is the kingly son through whom the kingly line is traced. That's a little bit interesting, don't you find? David, who sits on the throne, is the 7th son of Jesse. The last son sits on the throne. And the last son of David, born to Bathsheba, Solomon, sits on the throne. It sounds like the last have become first. The last son is the one who sits on the throne. Luke's lineage goes back to Adam, who is called the Son of God. Matthew's traces us forward to Jesus, the son of David. Okay, we're going to move on to some even more exciting things. The demarcation, if you look at verse 17, so all the generations from Adam to David were 14 generations, and from David to the deportation to Babylon, 14 generations, and from the deportation to Babylon to the Christ, 14 generations. So what you have are 3 groups, as Matthew defines it, 3 groups of deportations, 14 generations in each group. Here's what it looks like if we were to draw it out. Abraham to David is 800 years. David to the deportation is 400 years. The deportation of Babylon back to Israel to the Christ is 600 years. So they're not all exact. 800, 400, and 600. How do you fit 14 generations into those big categories? In fact, the first category, Abraham to David, encompasses 400 years during their time in Egypt. During that 400 years in Egypt, Matthew only records 3 generations. That's a stretch, because a generation is usually about 40 years. Obviously, Matthew has omitted tons of names. Or, in the second list, David to the deportation to Babylon, 400 years, Matthew omits 5 kings that we know were kings if you read 1st and 2nd Chronicles and 1st and 2nd Kings. Or, from the deportation to Babylon back to Israel, the other 14 generations up to Christ, in that section, Luke has 22 generations, where Matthew has 14. So what in the world is going on? It's not very literal, is it, or historical by any of our modern standards, this was completely acceptable among the Jews. They did history like this, and nobody threw a fit. It's a very inexact demarcation, and Matthew does that intentionally to show you that his point is not statistical, but theological. So he omits enough names. He picks and chooses, so he gets 14, and he divides them into 3 categories. What in the world is going on? Matthew's purpose is to locate Jesus in the history of these men, to place him into a stream of redemption, and to show that he's the culmination, he's the terminus of it, that he is the legitimate heir to the throne and the proper recipient of the promises God said to Abraham. But we might say a few more things on this. Matthew in verse 17 seems to be wanting to make a point without saying it as explicitly as we would like. He's saying, look, I just created three demarcations, 14 in each. What do you make of that? Why 14? Why 3? Well, he doesn't tell us why. So he leaves us to scratch our heads and come up with some good guesses. We know that the Jews practice something called gematria. Every letter in the alphabet has a numerical value. And so they would play games with that and derive theological lessons from that. We do that a little bit. If I say to you 666, you think of certain things right away. The Bible has said these 3 numbers laid side by side represent something theologically. The number of man, right? So David, D, if you add up those letters, because the vowels weren't in there, they just tacked the vowels underneath, adds up to the number 14. David is the 14th name in the first list. That might be something where we're going. 14 is important, the numerical value of David, whose name means beloved. All right, but there's maybe more. We have 3 sets of 14. 3 is a number of perfection. The Trinity is 3 persons. 3 is very big. We also have the number 7 doubled. Don't think of these 3 lists of 14, but think of these 3 lists of 7 doubled. 7 is the number of perfection. God created the world in 7 days. He rested on the 7th. The 7th day was for God the day of completion, perfection, and consummation. We have 3 groups in which 7 is doubled. What that communicates to you from each number of perfection, 3, 7 doubled, 3, 7 doubled, 3, 7 doubled, is that there is history that is advancing to a goal of perfection and consummation. It communicates progression and ultimately rest. The structure that Matthew divined represents, as you see in the bulletin, it represents completion and fullness. It tells the Jewish reader that the story he's going to relate is a story of the consummation of what was started in the beginning. Genesis, Biblos, Geneseos. Very wonderful things going on. God will bring this story to its own ordained end. But let me do something else for you that I find is super fun. These 3 cycles of 7 are reproduced somewhere else in the Bible. Anybody know where? They're reproduced in the last book of the Bible, where we have 7 seals, 7 trumpets, and 7 bowls. And each one of those 7 trumpets, 7 seals, trumpets, and bowls charts the history of the world to consummation, again and again, to its completion. John echoes Matthew to show us the unseen hand of God moving history to its conclusion. But there's something else to share with you. Matthew gives us 3 cycles of 7 repeated. How many 7s do we have? 2, 4, 6. The 7th 7 still has to be told. The 7th 7 is the story that will begin when Christ returns. And a new world and a new beginning is started. It's the return of Jesus. Jesus is the seventh seven. Here's something else that's exciting about this demarcation that Matthew does, is he shows us that what he's relating to us is the line of kings. A line of good kings, bad kings, but a line of God's kings. He's relating to us the Davidic monarchy. And so if we take these three categories, these three sections, what do we have? We have the origin and rise of the Davidic monarchy. We have the exile of the Davidic monarchy, and we have the return of the Davidic monarchy. And in the 14th child of the return of the Davidic monarchy, we have the promise of the resurrection of the Davidic monarchy, the restoration of it under Jesus, the King. So what we have in Matthew's genealogy is a genealogy of a king, not just any king, but Christ the King. And what Matthew wants you to do is he says, this is how you need to read my gospel. Jesus, the son of David. Verse 6, Jesse, the father of David, the king. A list of kings. And so this is how you read the Gospel of Matthew. It is the story of a king. A king who as a baby received lavish. These are all from the book of Matthew now. A story of a king who as a child received gifts from foreign dignitaries who laid them at his feet. The story of a king who in his toddler years was whisked away out of his own land to seek refuge in Egypt because another king sought to assassinate him, the true king. We have the story of a king who climbs upon a mountain and issues edicts and laws like Moses of old, and who pardons sinners, who casts demons out of his subjects and out of his realm, who feeds his subjects with bread, the king who walks on water and commands the waves to be still. Matthew is telling you, you read this gospel like this. This is the story of the king. The king who came back like Aslan to Narnia to restore it to all its glory. We the king. A king who issues benedictions and a king who welcomes children to his lap. And at his death, the charge that hung over the head of this king was the following: this is Jesus, the King of the Jews. And the leaders of the people mocked him. And they said to him, he saved others. He cannot save himself. He is the King of Israel. Let him come down now from the cross and we will believe in him. And this is the story of the king who didn't come down from the cross but came up from the grave. And before he ascended to his throne in heaven, sent his men, his cabinet. And he said, I want you to go now to the nations and bring them in and make them my disciples. This is the story of a king. I'm going to prevail upon your patience for a few moments just to finish off. This beautiful genealogy is the story of a king, a story of a new beginning, of Genesis part 2. Story of completion and perfection, 3 divisions of 7 doubled, Jesus being the 7th 7. But we have mothers who are in this genealogy that need to be mentioned to give them our nod of love and devotion. It is not unusual for women to be in genealogies. In 1 Chronicles 2, 14 mothers are mentioned by name, but 5 are mentioned in this one. And it's the first 4 I want to think about briefly. Tamar, who I mentioned this morning, Rahab, Ruth, Bathsheba, who in verse 6 is not mentioned by name, but referred to as the wife of Uriah. Why did Matthew mention these names? I think before, you may have heard sermons preached on this. I may have said this as well, but I did some studying as well this week. The common thought is that, well, you look at these women and they were like horrible sinners. Tamar contrived a way to have her father-in-law sleep with her. Let's call that incest or something like that, so that she could bear a son. Rahab was a prostitute. Ruth, who's stellar and wonderful, was a Moabite before she was converted, so she was an outright pagan. Bathsheba might be the only Jew in the list, but she was married to a Hittite. So oftentimes people read this genealogy and say, see, Matthew's trying to say, like, look at all these horrible sinners that God put into his story. That's amazing grace, how sweet the sound, that takes sinners like you and me and puts them into the story. But if you read the story as a Jew read it, these women are not villains, but heroines. Tamar preserved her family from extinction. Rahab saved Israel and enabled them, saved the spies, and saved her own family from destruction and was incorporated into God's people. Ruth forsake everything, no cost being too great, in order to become an Israelite, and even marrying Boaz. And Bathsheba, she's a little bit of a tougher one, but she was incorporated into David's family, and through her own righteousness, God blessed her, and she bears 5 sons for David. So what might be the point that we're looking at here? Well, it might be that God uses broken vessels like you and me, and through these broken vessels, these mothers, the royal Christ by royal descent came. That could be it. But I think Matthew's point is elsewhere focused. I think Matthew is saying these 4 women, possibly Bathsheba, 4 women, were all Gentiles. And God used them into the Jewish story about a Jewish king. And the Jewish king, before he ascends, will say, bring in the rest of the Gentiles. I think that's Matthew's point, that God is pleased in infinite grace to bring in other Gentiles like you and me and use them in a great commission. God used these women to advance his kingdom, accomplish his purposes, and bring forth his Son. As outsiders used by God, they demonstrate the grand scope of God to incorporate into the kingdom of his Son, you and me, to advance his kingdom and accomplish his glorious works until the whole earth is filled with his glory. I think that's the point. The whole earth will be filled with the glory of God. King Jesus reigns supreme, and the nations are pouring into his kingdom. We have Ruth, we have Rahab, we have Bathsheba, we have Tamar, the first droplets promising a rich ingathering. All right, only 2 more things and they will be brief. Matthew alerts us to the uniqueness of this particular king. If you look at verse 16, before that, it's always the father of Nathan, Nathan the father of Jacob, Jacob the father of Joseph. If you're tracking Matthew, he should have written Jacob the father of Joseph, Joseph the father of Jesus. He didn't do that, did he? Because Joseph is not the father of Jesus in the same way that Jacob was the father of Joseph. So Matthew just tweaks it. Jacob the father of Joseph, Joseph the husband of Mary, of whom was born Jesus, called the Christ. So Matthew is saying, here's the kingly descent, but Joseph is not, strictly speaking, the father of Jesus. I'll tell you about that in the next paragraph, how that happened. So something very beautiful there. How do we end this? What does this genealogy say about God? We have a faithful God who has fulfilled every promise ever spoken, who made a promise to Abraham and has kept it to the fullest, who has sent his Son of a long line of kings to be the King of kings, to be the Lord of lords, to bring in and establish his kingdom, a God abounding in sovereign, merciful grace. None of the centuries of decline and deportation could stop him from bringing his Son to earth, the ultimate Son of David. You look at this genealogy, and we read it as a story of God's King, and we rejoice because that King is on his throne. And my last question is a question I've asked before. Have I taught a class on the history of the world and your place in it? How do you get your name written into this genealogy? Because that's what it's all about. Believing in Jesus. If you believe in Jesus, Romans chapter 4, verse 11 says, Abraham's your father. I believe in Jesus, and I'm in this genealogy. And I can trace back to Jesus and say, yeah, I go right back to him. He's my king. He's my king. Believe in Jesus, you're in this genealogy. It's a genealogy of the king. All right, let's worship the king. Let's sing about him in 310. While shepherds watch their flocks by night.